I used to believe that a mother never truly becomes unnecessary. Even when her hair turns white and her hands begin to tremble, there is still a place for her in her child's life. I believed that with all my heart. I believed it while rocking him to sleep during stormy nights, while sewing his torn clothes by dim light, while waiting by the window long after sunset, hoping to see his silhouette returning home. Time passed quietly. My house grew quieter too. The walls still remember laughter, but now they only echo my footsteps. I tell myself that silence is just a season, that children grow, that life pulls them in many directions. I repeat this like a prayer, especially on days when the phone does not ring. The day he married, I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt. I told myself this was happiness, that gaining a new family did not mean losing the old one. I stood among guests, holding my breath so my tears would not fall. Everyone said I looked proud. I was. But somewhere deep inside, a small fear whispered that things would never be the same. First he still came by. Short visits. Polite smiles. Promises spoken quickly, as if time was chasing him. "I'll call," he said. "I'll come soon." I believed those words the way only a mother can, completely and without doubt. Then the calls became rare. The visits stopped. My questions stayed unasked, trapped in my chest. I did not want to seem demanding. I did not want to be a burden. So I waited. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. One evening I realized something had changed forever. I set the table for two out of habit, then slowly removed the second plate. My hands froze midair. In that moment I understood some goodbyes are never spoken aloud. They simply happen quietly while you are still waiting by the window. Mornings became the hardest. I would wake before the sun, listening to the old clock ticking on the wall, each second louder than the last. Once, those mornings were filled with purpose. Breakfast to prepare, voices to answer, footsteps rushing through the house. Now I moved slowly, as if sound itself might break something fragile inside me. I began to notice how invisible I had become. Not to the world, but to the one person who once looked for me in every crowd. I watched neighbors greet their children, laugh with them at the gates, complain about small things that only family can complain about. I smiled politely and walked past, carrying a weight no one could see. Sometimes I rehearsed conversations in my head. Nothing dramatic, just simple words. "How are you? Are you eating well? Do you remember the soup you loved as a child?" But when I imagined his face, distracted and distant, the words dissolved. I feared interrupting a life where I no longer fit. I told myself stories to survive the quiet. I said he was busy, that love changes shape, that marriage demands attention. I defended him in conversations he wasn't even part of. It felt easier to protect him than to admit I was hurting. On special days I waited a little longer. Birthdays, holidays. I kept the lights on, even when night fell deep and heavy. I cooked small portions just in case. The food often went cold. I learned to eat without appetite. One afternoon, I gathered old photographs from a drawer. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. There we were, muddy shoes, crooked smiles, arms wrapped tight. I searched those pictures for answers. At what moment did I become a memory instead of a presence? I realized then that forgetting doesn't always happen suddenly. It happens gently through missed calls, unanswered messages, postponed visits. It happens when love is assumed instead of nurtured. That night, I whispered his name into the dark, not as an accusation, but as a reminder, to him or maybe. I stopped checking the phone every hour. Not because I no longer cared, but because hope can exhaust an old heart. Each unanswered ring felt heavier than the last, like a question left hanging in the air too long. So I learned a new kind of patience, the kind that hurts quietly. The house began to mirror my loneliness. A small crack appeared near the window frame. One chair started to wobble. Things broke slowly, just like relationships do. I fixed what I could with my own hands, even when my fingers ached. Asking for help felt unnecessary. After all, I had managed alone before. Or so I told myself. Sometimes memories arrived without warning. A song on the radio. The smell of rain. A laugh from outside that sounded almost familiar. In those moments I was no longer an old woman in an empty kitchen. I was young again, wiping scraped knees, tying shoelaces, staying awake through fevers and fears. Love had once been so natural, so unquestioned. I wondered when I became optional. Not unwanted, just easily postponed. I imagined his life filled with noise, warmth, new traditions. I imagined a table where there was no place set for me, not out of cruelty but out of forgetting. That thought hurt more than anger ever could. One day I decided to write a letter. Not to accuse. Not to beg. Just to remind. I wrote about the weather, about the garden, about how quiet evenings had become. I folded the paper carefully, then unfolded it again. In the end, I placed it back in the drawer. Words felt too heavy to send, too fragile to risk being ignored. I realized then that love doesn't disappear, it waits. It sits patiently in the corner, hoping to be noticed again. And I wondered how long a mother's love could wait before it turned into something else. Something silent. That night, I left the porch light on like I always used to. Even though I knew no one was coming, turning it off felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to accept yet. The seasons changed, but inside my house time stood still. Leaves fell, snow covered the steps, flowers returned again. Yet my days followed the same quiet rhythm. Wake up. Make tea. Sit by the window. Wait. I learned every crack in the ceiling, every sound the floor made at night. Loneliness teaches you details you never wanted to know. People often say, "You should call first." They don't understand how pride and fear can live in the same heart. What if I called and heard annoyance instead of joy? What if my voice interrupted laughter that didn't include me? I convinced myself that silence was safer than rejection. Once I passed a family on the street. A young woman walked beside her child, holding his hand tightly. The boy pulled away, impatient, eager to run ahead. She sighed but smiled anyway. I recognized that smile immediately. It was the same smile I used to wear, tired, loving, forgiving without being asked. In that moment I wanted to warn her. But love never listens to warnings. I began to question myself. Had I asked for too much? Had I given too little? Mothers are good at blaming themselves. We replay old moments, searching for mistakes, even when none were made. I wondered if I had raised him too strong, too independent. Maybe he learned too well how to live without me. One evening, the phone rang unexpectedly. My heart jumped so hard it hurt. I stared at the screen, afraid to breathe. But it wasn't him. Just a wrong number. After I hung up, I laughed softly, then cried harder than I had in years. Hope can be cruel when it appears without warning. That night, I sat in the dark and finally admitted the truth I had been avoiding. Being forgotten doesn't mean being unloved. Sometimes it means being taken for granted. And that realization settled in my chest like a cold, heavy stone. Still, before going to bed, I whispered a quiet good night into the silence. Old habits die slowly, and some love refuses to die at all. I started speaking to the house as if it could answer me. I told the walls about my day, complained to the kettle when it took too long to boil, wished the chairs good night before turning off the lights. It wasn't madness. It was survival. Silence becomes unbearable when it has no shape. I noticed how carefully I plan my days now. Not around people but around energy. Some mornings, even opening the curtains felt like too much. On those days, I allowed myself to sit still, holding a warm cup of tea, pretending that rest was enough company. The mailbox became a place of quiet disappointment. Bills arrived on time. Advertisements too. But never a letter written with familiar handwriting. I wondered if anyone would notice if I stopped checking it altogether. Probably not. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. Once I found an old scarf in the back of the closet. I remembered wrapping it around his neck on cold mornings, scolding him gently while secretly enjoying how much he needed me. I pressed the fabric to my face. It no longer smelled like him, but I pretended it did. Memory has its own senses. I realized then that I was living between two worlds, the past that felt warm and the present that felt unfinished. I didn't belong fully to either. I was not waiting for a miracle anymore. I was waiting for acknowledgement, for proof that I still mattered beyond memories. Late one evening, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes looked tired, but there was something else there too, quiet strength. I had survived harder things than being forgotten. Yet this pain felt different, deeper, because it came from love. Before sleeping, I asked myself a question I had avoided for too long. If he never comes back the way he used to, who will I become then? I began to understand that time does not heal everything. Some wounds simply learn how to hide. I carried mine gently, like something fragile that could shatter if touched the wrong way. I smiled when people spoke to me, nodded at their kindness, but inside I guarded a quiet ache that belonged only to me. One afternoon, I decided to clean the attic. It had been years since I last climbed those steps. Dust filled the air, and every box felt heavier than it should have. I found old-school notebooks, drawings made with careless joy, small trophies that once meant the world. I held each item as if it were alive, afraid that letting go might erase something important. There was a moment when I almost called him. My finger hovered over the number, my heart racing like it used to when he was late coming home. But fear won again. Fear of indifference. Fear that my voice would sound like an obligation rather than a welcome sound. I noticed how carefully I avoided places we used to go together. The park. The bakery on the corner. Even certain streets carried echoes I wasn't ready to face. Loss doesn't always come from death. Sometimes it comes from distance stretched thin over time. That evening, I made a decision without realizing it. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come. I stopped expecting explanations. Not because I forgave, but because I was tired. Tired of hoping, tired of breaking my own heart. Yet, before turning off the light, I checked the phone one last time. Old habits linger. Love leaves traces, even when it has nowhere to go. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I wondered if he ever thought of me the way I thought of him. Suddenly, without reason, like a quiet ache that appears in the middle of an ordinary day. I started going for short walks, not to reach anywhere, but to remind myself that I was still part of the world. The air felt different outside. Less heavy, less judgmental. Trees didn't ask questions. Birds didn't expect explanations. They accepted my presence without needing a reason. At the park, I often sat on the same bench. I watched people pass by carrying lives full of movement and noise. Young couples argued softly, then laughed. Parents chased children who never seemed to tire. I wondered if anyone could tell that I once had a role in a life like that. Or if I looked like someone who had always been alone. One afternoon, a child waved at me. A simple gesture, innocent and brief. I waved back, surprised by how much it warmed me. For a moment I felt seen. That feeling stayed with me longer than I expected. It reminded me that being noticed doesn't always require history. I thought about how easily people assume mothers are endless. Endless patience. Endless understanding. Endless forgiveness. Few ask what happens when that endlessness begins to crack. When love is still there, but the strength to carry it alone is fading. At home, I rearranged the furniture slightly. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to feel like I had made a choice for myself. The room felt unfamiliar at first, then strangely lighter. Change, I realized, doesn't always come as a storm. Sometimes it comes as a quiet decision. That night, I dreamed of knocking on a door that never opened. I woke up with my heart racing, my hands clenched. Dreams can be cruel. They show us what we want, then disappear without explanation. As morning light filled the room, I asked myself something new. Not why did he forget me, but what do I do with the love that has nowhere to go? I began to give my days small purposes. Nothing grand, just reasons to stand up in the morning. I watered the plants more carefully, spoke to them as if they depended on my voice. I baked bread even when I knew I would eat it alone. The smell filled the house and for a moment made it feel less abandoned. I noticed how memories no longer attacked me as fiercely. They arrived softly now, like tired visitors who no longer wished to argue. I let them sit with me. I stopped pushing them away. Perhaps pain grows sharper when it is resisted. One evening, I found myself setting the table again. One plate, one cup, one chair pulled out. I didn't feel the same sting as before. Acceptance, I realized, doesn't come as relief. It comes as a quiet understanding that life has changed its shape. I thought about all the things I never said. Not complaints. Not anger. Just love. Simple words that felt unnecessary at the time because I believed they would always have another chance. That belief faded slowly, like daylight in winter. I wondered if he noticed my absence the way I noticed his. Or if my place in his life had been filled so gently that no gap remained. Being replaced isn't always about someone taking your seat. Sometimes it's about no longer being expected to sit at all. Late at night, I opened the drawer again and took out the unfinished letter. I read it carefully, then added one final line. Not a plea. Not a reminder. Just truth. I folded the paper and held it in my hands for a long time, unsure whether it was meant to be sent or simply acknowledged. As I turned off the light, I felt something unfamiliar, sadness, yes, but also dignity. I was still a mother, even if my role had become invisible. The next morning, I didn't rush to the mailbox. I let it wait, just like life had taught me to wait for everything else. Instead, I sat by the window and watched the street wake up. Cars passed. Doors opened. Someone laughed loudly. The world continued, unaware of the quiet changes happening inside me. I realized I had been measuring my worth by his attention, by missed calls, by empty holidays. That realization stung, but it also freed something in me. A mother's love is powerful, but it should not erase the mother herself. I began sorting through old things more decisively now. Not with sadness, but with intention. I kept what felt meaningful. I let go of what only held pain. Letting go didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like making space to breathe. At the market, a familiar face stopped me to talk. We spoke longer than expected. About weather, about age, about small aches that come with time. When we parted, I noticed something surprising. I felt lighter. Connection didn't have to come from the past to matter. That evening, the phone rang again. My heart no longer jumped. I answered calmly. It was another wrong number. I smiled to myself. Hope had stopped controlling me. That alone felt like progress. I placed the letter back in the drawer, still unsent. Some words are written not to be read by others, but to be understood by yourself. I had said what I needed to say, even if no one else heard it. Before sleeping, I whispered a quiet thank you, to the life I had lived, to the love I had given, to the strength that had carried me this far. Forgetting hurts. But being forgotten does not mean being empty. For the first time in a long while, I slept without waiting for a sound that never came. Something changed after that night. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Just a gentle shift. Like the moment you realize winter is ending without seeing the snow melt. I moved through the day with less heaviness in my steps. The silence in the house no longer felt like an accusation. I began doing things without explaining them to anyone. I took longer walks. I sat in the sun when it appeared, even if only for a few minutes. I allowed myself small pleasures without guilt. It felt strange at first, as if I were breaking an unspoken rule. I noticed how often I had apologized in my life for taking space, for asking questions, for existing loudly. I stopped doing that. Quietly. Without announcement. I had earned the right to be here, even if no one was watching. One afternoon, I heard laughter outside and didn't immediately feel pain. I felt curiosity instead. Life was still happening and I was still part of it. That realization felt like a small victory. I looked at old photographs again, but this time I didn't search them for blame. I saw love. I saw effort. I saw a woman who gave everything she had. And that, I realized, was enough. That evening I finally sealed the letter. Not because I expected a response, but because I was no longer afraid of silence. Whether it was read or not no longer defined me. As I placed the envelope near the door, I felt something close to peace. Whatever happens next, I told myself, I will meet it standing. Not waiting by the window but walking forward. And for the first time, the house felt less like a place of absence and more like a place where I still belonged. The days after that passed with a strange calm. I no longer counted them by calls or visits. I counted them by small victories, waking without heaviness, finishing a cup of tea while it was still warm, laughing softly at my own thoughts. These moments didn't erase the past, but they softened its edges. I started noticing people who had always been there, quietly. A neighbor who waved every morning. The shopkeeper who asked how I was feeling. Their kindness had existed all along, but I had been too focused on one absence to see it. I thought about how love narrows us sometimes. It teaches us to look in only one direction, waiting for one person to turn back. When they don't, the world feels empty. But it isn't. It just waits for us to look up again. One evening, I found the courage to open the drawer where I kept the letter. I reread it slowly. It didn't sound like weakness. It sounded honest. And honesty, I realized, is not something to be ashamed of. I imagined different outcomes. The letter could be read and ignored, read and misunderstood, or never read at all. Strangely, none of those possibilities scared me anymore. I had already survived the worst part, the waiting. That night, I placed the envelope into my bag. I didn't tell myself I would send it the next day. I simply allowed the possibility to exist. That felt enough. As I lay in bed, I thought about the many roles I had played in life. Daughter, wife, mother, and now something else. Something undefined. Maybe that was okay. Sleep came gently without questions. The morning air felt sharper, clearer. I stepped outside earlier than usual, holding my coat tightly around me. The street looked ordinary, but I felt different walking through it. As if I were no longer hiding behind my own thoughts. At the post office, I stood in line with the letter pressed against my chest. My heart wasn't racing. It was steady. I watched people ahead of me send packages, postcards, fragments of their lives sealed in paper. When my turn came, I hesitated only for a second before handing it over. Not as a plea but as a release. Walking home, I felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the words were no longer trapped inside me. Heavier because I knew this step closed a door I could never fully reopen. Once something is said, it cannot be taken back. Days passed without change. No response. No sign that the letter had even been noticed. And yet, I did not collapse under that silence. I had prepared myself for it. Strength, I learned, is often built quietly long before it is needed. I continued my routines. Walks. Tea. Conversations with strangers who slowly became familiar. Life didn't wait for answers, and neither did I. One afternoon, I felt a strange urge to clean the front room. The one I had kept untouched for years. I opened the windows wide and let fresh air in. Dust rose then settled. Felt symbolic, though I didn't say that out loud. As evening came, I realized something unexpected. Sending the letter wasn't about being remembered. It was about remembering myself. And for the first time, I felt truly present in my own life. Not as someone waiting to be chosen, but as someone who already was. I began to notice how often I had lived in the future before. Waiting for a call, a visit, a sign. Now I stayed in the present. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was real. Reality, I discovered, hurts less than endless expectation. One afternoon, I rearranged the shelves and found an old calendar tucked behind a book. The pages were filled with notes, reminders, small circles drawn around important days. I stopped turning pages when I realized how many of those dates had once been centered around him. Appointments, visits, meals planned in advance. I closed the calendar gently. That chapter had already been lived. I started writing again. Not letters, just thoughts. Short sentences. Observations. Feelings I never allowed myself to name before. Writing didn't solve anything. But it gave shape to what had been floating inside me for years. People often say mothers are strong. What they don't say is how lonely that strength can be. How much of it is built from silence and sacrifice, not praise. I carried that truth with me now, not as a burden, but as recognition. One evening as I prepared dinner, I realized I was humming. I stopped, surprised. It had been a long time since sound had left my mouth without intention. That small moment felt like proof that something inside me was healing. I didn't know if the letter had been read. I didn't know if it ever would be. But I knew this: I was no longer defined by the waiting. My life was mine again, even if it looked different than I once imagined. As night fell, I turned off the porch light. Not out of sadness, but out of choice. I no longer needed it to guide anyone home. The days grew warmer, and with them came a quiet courage I hadn't felt in years. I opened the windows more often now, letting the outside world mix with my own. Sounds of life drifted in: footsteps, voices, distant music. I no longer flinched at them. I noticed how my reflection had changed. Not younger, not brighter, but steadier. My eyes no longer searched for something behind me. They looked forward. That felt new. That felt earned. I spent more time outside. I sat on the same park bench, but this time I wasn't observing from the sidelines. I smiled at people. Sometimes they smiled back. Connection didn't have to be deep to be real. One afternoon, I heard my phone ring while I was watering the plants. I didn't rush. I finished what I was doing, wiped my hands, then answered. It was a familiar voice, but not his. Just someone checking in, asking if I was well. And for once I answered honestly, yes. That single word surprised me more than anything else. I thought about how much of my life I had given quietly, without expecting anything in return. And yet, somewhere along the way, I had forgotten to give something to myself. Time. Attention. Grace. That evening, I cooked a proper meal and set the table with care. Not for visitors. Not in hope. Just because I deserved it. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, feeling present in my own body. As night settled in, I realized something important. I was no longer waiting to be remembered. I was remembering myself. I began to think differently about the word forgotten. It no longer felt like a wound someone else had given me. It felt like a space. Empty at first, painful, but eventually open to something new. Not replacement. Not erasure. Just expansion. I found comfort in routine again, but this time it didn't feel like waiting. It felt like living. Morning light, warm tea, the sound of pages turning in a book. These small things held me together better than hope ever had. Sometimes memories still surfaced. A laugh. A voice calling from another room. But they no longer pulled me backward. They walked beside me, quietly, without demanding attention. I allowed them to exist without letting them decide my direction. One evening as I cleaned a drawer, I found an old note written in shaky handwriting, my own from years ago. A reminder to pick up bread. To rest. To forgive. I smiled at how long I had been reminding myself of things I was only now beginning to understand. I thought about forgiveness often. Not forgiveness for forgetting, but forgiveness for myself, for the years I spent shrinking, waiting, questioning my worth. I didn't need permission to move forward. I never had. That night I sat by the window again. Not to wait. Just to watch the sky darken. I felt no urgency, no ache. Just a quiet presence within myself. If he ever thinks of me, I hope it's gently. Without guilt. Without weight. And if he doesn't, that will no longer define me. I turned off the light and went to bed knowing this truth. Love given freely never disappears. It simply changes where it lives. There are moments when the past knocks softly, just to see if the door is still open. It happened to me one quiet afternoon without warning. A familiar melody drifted from a passing radio, and for a second my chest tightened. But then it loosened again. The pain no longer stayed. It only visited. I realized I had stopped measuring time by absence. Days were no longer counted by what didn't happen, but by what did. A conversation. A walk. A warm meal. Presence had replaced longing. I began speaking more kindly to myself. When my body felt tired, I rested without shame. When sadness appeared, I allowed it space, knowing it would pass. Strength, I learned, is not the absence of feeling. It is the ability to survive it without losing yourself. One morning, I cleaned the window where I once waited so often. I wiped away years of fingerprints, dust, and quiet hope. The glass became clear. I could see the street properly now, without distortion. It felt symbolic, though I didn't need to say why. I thought about all the mothers like me, quiet, patient, invisible, carrying love that has nowhere obvious to go. I wish they knew what I was only just learning. That their lives still matter, even when the role they lived for changes. That evening, I felt gratitude instead of sorrow. Gratitude for having loved deeply. Not everyone gets to experience that, even if it ends in silence. As I prepared for sleep, I understood something final and gentle. I had stopped waiting to be chosen. I had chosen myself. The world felt quieter in a different way now. Not empty but calm. I no longer filled the silence with questions. I let it be what it was, space to breathe, to think, to simply exist without explanation. I noticed how my laughter sounded unfamiliar to me at first. Softer, cautious, then gradually more certain. It surprised me that joy could return without an announcement, slipping in gently when I wasn't watching for it. I spent time doing things I once postponed. I sorted photographs properly, placing them in albums instead of drawers. I kept some close. Others I let go of. Memory, I learned, doesn't need clutter to survive. Sometimes I wondered if he had changed too. If life had shaped him in ways I no longer recognized. But those thoughts didn't stay long. They came and went like clouds. I no longer chased them. One afternoon, I helped someone carry groceries. A small act. A simple thank you. It filled a place in me that had been empty for years. Love doesn't vanish when it's unused. It looks for new forms. As evening settled in, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Contentment without conditions. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was no longer fighting reality. I looked around my home and realized it no longer felt like a waiting room. It felt lived in again. That mattered more than I ever expected. Before bed, I whispered a quiet promise to myself, to never again disappear inside someone else's absence. And I slept peacefully without dreams pulling me backward. One morning the phone rang in a way that felt different. Not urgent. Not accidental. Just steady. I didn't rush to it. I finished tying my scarf, then answered calmly, prepared for anything, or nothing at all. The voice on the other end hesitated. I listened without interrupting. There were pauses, uneven breaths, words searching for their place. I didn't fill the silence. I had learned that silence doesn't always need rescuing. Nothing dramatic was said. No apologies poured out. No explanations were offered. Just ordinary sentences, careful and unsure. And yet, something inside me remained still. I didn't lean forward. I didn't shrink. I stayed where I was. When the call ended, I sat down and waited for the familiar ache. It didn't come. Instead, I felt clarity. Contact does not always mean return. And hearing a voice does not restore what time has reshaped. I realized I no longer needed to be seen in a certain way. I had already seen myself. That recognition was enough. That afternoon I made tea and drank it slowly. I didn't replay the conversation. I didn't search for hidden meaning. Peace, I learned, is choosing not to reopen old wounds just to prove they still hurt. As evening approached, I felt grateful, not for the call, but for who I had become before it happened. Strength arrived quietly, long before it was tested. I turned off the lights and smiled softly, knowing this. Whatever comes next, I will meet it whole, not waiting, not reaching. Just standing firmly in my own life. The next days unfolded without tension. No anticipation. No disappointment. Just life moving at its own honest pace. I noticed how different that felt. When you stop expecting, every moment becomes lighter. I didn't tell anyone about the call. Some things are not meant to be explained or shared. They are meant to be understood quietly, like a private turning point. I carried it with calm, not secrecy. I spent time outside more often. The sky seemed wider somehow, as if it had always been that way and I was only now looking properly. I watched clouds drift without wondering where they were going. That felt familiar. That felt right. I realized something important. I no longer needed repair. I wasn't broken. I had simply been stretched by love, pulled thin by waiting, and then slowly returned to myself. Healing didn't make me new. It made me whole again. One evening I opened the drawer where I once kept reminders of absence. It was empty now. Not because I had erased the past, but because it no longer needed a special place. Memory had softened into something manageable. I thought about the future without fear. Whether it included visits, calls, or long silence no longer defined its value. My life had weight on its own now. Before bed, I stood by the window not to look out but to look in. I placed my hand on the glass and whispered something I had never said before. I am enough. And for the first time I believed it without hesitation. I no longer wait by the window. Not because I stopped caring, but because I finally understood something simple and powerful. Waiting is not the same as loving. Love can exist without standing still. My days have found their own rhythm now. Morning light. Familiar streets. Quiet evenings that no longer feel empty. I live inside my life again. Not on its edges. Sometimes I think about the past, not with pain, not with anger, but with honesty. I gave everything I could. I loved fully without conditions. That was never a mistake. Love is never a mistake, even when it isn't returned in the way we hoped. If he remembers me one day, I hope it comes gently. Like a warm thought. Like a soft regret that doesn't hurt but teaches. And if he never does, that truth no longer frightens me. I am still a mother. That will never change. But I am also a woman who learned how to stand alone without becoming bitter. A woman who turned absence into understanding, and silence into strength. The house holds my footsteps again. Not echoes, real sounds. I move through the rooms with certainty, not longing. This is my life. It always was. And if this story reaches someone who is still waiting, still hoping, still shrinking to be remembered, let this be your answer. You do not disappear when someone forgets you. You remain. And that is enough.